The old man had been sitting alone for 40 minutes before anyone noticed he was there. He'd found a folding chair near the back of the tent, off to the side of where the real party was happening, and he'd positioned himself with the careful deliberateness of someone who has spent a lifetime choosing positions. His back was to a load-bearing pole. He had a clear sightline to both exits. He held a paper cup of iced tea, and he watched the room the way a man watches weather, not anxiously, not passively, but with the settled attention of someone who has learned that what's coming is usually already visible if you know where to look. His name was Walter Edmund Briggs, and he was 78 years old, and he had driven down from Kenosha that morning with his son-in-law Phil because his daughter Joanna had asked him to come, and Walter did not have a good reason not to. The occasion was the Millhaven American Legion Post's annual Memorial Day Luncheon, held every year in the large white tent behind the post hall on Carpenter Street. Walter had attended exactly twice before, both times at Joanna's insistence, both times sitting roughly where he was sitting now. He was not a member of the post. He was not a member of any post. He had never applied for membership in any veterans organization and had no intention of starting. He went to these things because Joanna worried about him being alone in the house in Kenosha with only a retriever named Biscuit and a habit of reading too late into the night, and because the drive down was only 40 minutes, and because somewhere in the back of him, in the part that still remembered things without being asked to, the date mattered. It had always mattered. If you believe every man who served deserves to be known, type Honor in the comments. This story is for them. He was wearing a grey sport coat over a white Oxford shirt, the same combination he'd worn to every occasion, requiring a jacket for the past 11 years, since Margaret passed and there was no longer anyone to suggest something different. The jacket was clean and well pressed, which meant Joanna had gotten to his closet again, which meant she was still worrying. He'd stopped telling her not to. It was easier than the conversation that followed. The tent held maybe 90 people. Round tables with red, white and blue plastic overlays, a podium at the front with a microphone that fed into a PA system that worked approximately 70% of the time, a long buffet table along the left wall that currently held sandwich platters, potato salad, and a large sheet cake decorated with a small fondant flag. Somewhere behind the podium, a compact disc player, the post had not upgraded to anything newer, and Walter found this quietly correct, was cycling through a program of patriotic songs at a volume low enough to feel respectful rather than festive. Walter watched the room. He ate a sandwich. He drank his iced tea. He noticed the man at the center table almost immediately, the way he noticed most things, automatically, without trying, the habit too old to switch off. The man was perhaps 60, broad-shouldered, with the kind of physical confidence that comes from size rather than discipline. He was wearing a VFW cap with a pin collection along the brim. Walter counted 6 pins without meaning to, and a windbreaker with a unit patch on the left shoulder that Walter recognized as 1st Cavalry Division. He was holding court at his table with the practiced ease of a man who has been the most interesting person in every room he's ever entered, and has fully internalized this as a fact of the universe. His name, Walter would later learn, was Curtis Boland. He sold real estate in Rockford. He had been coming to this post-luncheon for 9 years. Walter caught fragments across the tent, the Drang Valley, 3 days without resupply, 11 confirmed. He let the words reach him and let them pass through, the way you let cold air pass through an open window in a room you're not trying to heat. Something in him registered the cadence of the story, the particular smoothness of it, the way it came out at exactly the right pace, with exactly the right pauses. And that registration happened below the level of decision in some older and more reliable part of him, and it ticked. He went back to his sandwich. He watched the flags along the tent wall move in the May breeze. He waited. He had always been good at waiting. He had spent the better part of 3 years being good at it in places where the alternative was dying. Joanna appeared at his elbow with a 2nd cup of iced tea and the expression she'd been wearing all morning, which was the expression of a woman who wants her father to have a good time and has correctly assessed that her father's definition of a good time differs from most people's. "You doing okay over here?" "I'm excellent," Walter said, which was more than he'd usually offer, and which made her narrow her eyes slightly because she knew him. "You can come sit at our table. I can see everything from here." She looked at him for a moment. She had her mother's eyes, which was something Walter thought about more than he mentioned. Phil is talking to a man who restores vintage motorcycles, she said. You could rescue him. Phil likes motorcycles. Phil likes talking about motorcycles with strangers for 20 minutes while his potato salad gets warm, Joanna said. There's a difference. Walter smiled. He told her he'd come over in a little while. He meant it loosely enough to be kind without being a commitment, and she knew the difference, and she went back across the tent with the particular walk of a woman who has accepted something she is not entirely satisfied with. Walter looked back at the centre table. Curtis Boland had assembled around himself a small audience of 4 people, 2 men around his own age, a younger woman in a red blazer who appeared to be the post's public affairs coordinator, and an older gentleman in a Korean War veteran cap who had the expression of a man listening politely to something he cannot fully follow but understands is meant to impress him. The story had moved on. Now it was about a specific engagement, a particular hillside, the names of men in his unit who had not come back. Curtis delivered these with weight, with the practiced gravity of someone who has discovered that certain sentences close doors. Nobody questioned the sentences that contained loss. Walter set down his cup. He looked at the flags again. He thought about something he had not thought about in 6 weeks, which was a personal record and which he had achieved through the disciplined application of chess problems and home repair projects, and the company of a dog who asked nothing of him except his presence. Then he picked up his cane, a plain one, aluminum, nothing that announced itself, and he stood up and he walked across the tent. He did not walk quickly. There was no urgency in him that anyone watching could have identified. He moved through the tables at the steady, unhurried pace of a man who has been deliberate about his movement for 56 years. Since a particular afternoon in August of 1967, when moving too quickly through a tree line in Bin Din province, had killed the man walking in front of him, and had not killed Walter Briggs, and Walter had spent the rest of his life understanding the precise difference between those 2 outcomes. He arrived at the edge of the circle. Curtis Boland was in the middle of a sentence, because at that point we'd been cut off for close to 48 hours, and the NVA were moving up through the draw, and we had maybe— "Which draw?" Walter said. He said it the way you ask for directions, pleasantly, specifically, without implication. Curtis looked at him. The circle opened the way circles open when someone unexpected arrives, automatically, without discussion. The public affairs coordinator shifted her chair. The man in the Korean War cap looked up with mild interest. "Sorry?" Curtis said. "The draw you're describing," Walter said. "The Drang Valley covers a significant area. There are several draws that saw action in November 65. I'm curious which one you're referring to." He extended his hand. "Walter Briggs. I came down with the Novaks." Curtis took the hand. The handshake was firm on both sides, though for different reasons. "Kurt Boland." He had the slight recalibration of a man who has been interrupted but not yet threatened. "I'm not sure I can name every feature of the terrain at this point. It was a long time ago." "Of course," Walter said. He pulled a chair from the nearest empty table and sat down at the edge of the circle. He did not ask permission. He did this with such complete naturalness that no one thought to register it. "Which unit were you with? 7th Cavalry, 1st or 2nd Battalion?" Curtis's eyes moved slightly. "2nd." Walter nodded slowly. He looked at the tablecloth between them as though reading something in it. "Bravo Company? Charlie." Walter nodded again. He had the expression of a man confirming a minor detail, the way you confirm a street address before you type it into a map. "And you came in by helicopter initially? Landing Zone Albany or LZ X-ray?" "X-ray," Curtis said. His voice had acquired something new, not defensiveness, not quite, but the quality of a man who is recalculating while still moving forward, which is a particular kind of effort. "You were at LZ X-ray," Walter said. "November 14th, that's right." Walter looked at him for a moment with the same pleasant, interested expression he'd been wearing since he sat down. Then he said, "Tell me about the grass." Curtis blinked. The grass? The elephant grass at X-ray. It was chest-high in places, taller in others, and the way it moved in the rotor wash from the Hueys was, "There's really nothing else like it." Walter kept his voice conversational, the tone of a man sharing a sensory memory he's fond of. "I'm curious if it hit you the same way it hit me, whether you remember the sound it made." Something shifted in Curtis Boland's face. Not alarm. A subtle reconfiguration. The way a man's face changes when he realizes the ground has a different quality than he thought. "It was tall grass," Curtis said. "In a hot LZ, you're not taking notes on the landscaping." Fair enough, Walter said. No, that's fair. He nodded, looking down at the tablecloth again. He appeared to be simply agreeing, and he appeared to be doing this honestly, and neither of these appearances was fully accurate. The heat was something that November. Do you remember the heat? Vietnam was hot. It was, Walter agreed, though the Central Highlands ran cooler than the coast, particularly in the mornings. The valley floor was different again. There was a particular quality to the air down in the draws, especially before the firefight started and the smoke changed everything. He paused. You'd remember the air before it changed. That part tends to stay. The young woman in the red blazer had very quietly stopped taking notes on the small pad she'd been holding. The older gentleman in the Korean war cap was watching Walter with an expression that had shifted from polite interest to something more careful. Curtis said, I remember what I remember. Every man who was there processed it differently. Absolutely, Walter said. Yes. He placed both hands on the table and looked at them for a moment, his right hand slightly more scarred than his left along the back, an old burn that he'd stopped explaining sometime in the 1970s. Tell me about the losses. We took casualties, Curtis said. You mentioned 11 confirmed, Walter said, still pleasantly. Over what period? The engagement, which was roughly how long for Charlie Company specifically. The fighting at X-Ray stretched across multiple days. I'm trying to understand your company's particular experience. Curtis Bolland set his beer down on the table carefully, as though placing it on an unstable surface. I'm not sure what you're looking for, Walter. I'm not looking for anything. And this was true, in the way that most of the truest things are also incomplete. I find that people who were there describe the same events very differently depending on where they stood, and I've always thought that was worth understanding. The Drang is the kind of engagement that deserves to be understood correctly. He folded his hands. What were the names of the men you lost? The table went quiet. Not the whole tent. The tent was still doing what tents full of people do, conversations and the sound of silverware and the pay system cycling from America the Beautiful to something instrumental. But in this radius of 6 feet, something had changed, and the people at the table knew it had changed, even the ones who couldn't have said exactly when. Curtis looked at Walter. Walter looked back at Curtis with the patience of a man who has waited longer for more important things. That was 59 years ago, Curtis said. It was, Walter said. But you remember the draw, you remember the 48 hours, you remember the 11 confirmed. He held the eye contact with the steady, undemanding quality of still water. A man remembers the names. The young woman in the red blazer, her name was Angela Tran, and she had taken this job 14 months ago because she believed veteran stories deserved to be preserved, and she was now watching something she had not expected to see and could not entirely interpret, pressed her pen against the blank page of her notepad and did not write anything. Curtis opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the tablecloth. Walter said, Then let me tell you about some names. What happened in the next 10 minutes would be discussed on Carpenter Street and in the parking lots of 2 nearby diners for the rest of the month. What happened would find its way into a post on a Veterans History website, and from there into 3 different Facebook groups and a Twitter thread that accumulated 4,000 replies over 72 hours. What happened was not a scene in the way that public confrontations are scenes. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of thing that is hard to describe afterward because the power of it lived in what was not said as much as in what was. Walter Briggs reached into the inside pocket of his grey sport coat, the one Joanna had pressed, and he removed a folded piece of paper. It was not new paper. The fold lines were old and soft, the kind that happen to paper that has been opened and refolded many times over many years. He placed it flat on the table and smoothed it once with his palm. It was a handwritten list. The ink was old, faded to a brown-grey in places. The handwriting was small and precise, the kind that comes from training yourself to write small because the surface available for writing is often very small. Private First Class Calvin Doss, he said, 19 years old, Covington, Kentucky, killed at LZ X-Ray on November 14, 1965, in the first wave of contact. He was the first man I saw go down that morning. The table was completely still. He had written a letter to his mother that he hadn't mailed. He asked Sergeant Bellamy to send it. Bellamy was killed 4 hours later. The letter was eventually sent by the chaplain. I know this because I was there when the chaplain found it. He had not looked up from the paper. He was reading from it, but he was reading the way people read things they have already memorized. Not to retrieve the information, but to honor the form of it, the act of saying it properly. Corporal Andre Simmons, 22 years old, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Second day of fighting, November 15th. He was a machine gunner. He held his position for approximately 4 hours after being wounded in the left leg. There are men who came home because he stayed in that position. I have spoken to 2 of them. The older gentleman in the Korean War cap, his name was Henry Potowski, and he was 81 years old, and he had not spoken since Walter sat down, had placed both hands flat on the table in front of him and was looking at them. Sergeant Leonard Chu, 26, San Jose, California. He was the kind of sergeant who knew every man in his platoon's full name and home address and something specific about each of their families. Not as a tactic, just because he thought it was the right way to lead. He died on the morning of November 16th. The PA system in the tent had reached the end of its track and paused before the next one began, and in that pause the silence had a particular quality that Angela Tran would later try to describe and find she could not find the right word for. Sacred was too large. Honest was closer. It was the silence of people in the presence of something that was irreducibly true. Curtis Boland had not moved. His hands were in his lap. The confidence that had organized itself around him had done something complicated and then gone somewhere, and what remained was a man in a VFW cap sitting very still. Walter looked up from the paper. "I can keep going," he said quietly. "There are 14 names on this list. I have carried this list for 59 years. I can tell you what each of those men was doing when I last saw them, and what they were saying and what the light was like, because that is how memory works when something matters enough. You don't choose to keep it. It keeps itself." He folded the paper back along its old lines and returned it to his inside pocket. "When a man says he lost 11 men, Walter said, he means he knew 11 men who did not come home. He means he has been carrying their absence the way he carries his own name. He means he could tell you right now, in any order, in any combination, exactly who they were." He held Curtis Boland's eyes. Curtis said nothing. His jaw moved once. He looked at the table. It was at this moment that a woman sat down at the table. She did not ask to join. She did not announce herself. She simply came from the direction of the buffet, carrying a plate and a cup of coffee, and she sat in the empty chair to Walter's left, and the circle shifted to accommodate her the way it had shifted for Walter, automatically, without deliberation. She was perhaps 72 years old, white-haired, compact, wearing a blazer with a pin on the lapel that Walter recognized before he could have said how. The Drang Veterans Association, an organization he was aware of but had never joined. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she had driven from Joliet that morning because she came to this post every Memorial Day and had for 16 years, since her brother, James Calloway, had been posthumously honored by this post for his service with the 7th Cavalry Division in November of 1965. At a landing zone called X-Ray, on a morning that was the last morning of his life, she sat down, she looked at Curtis Boland. She looked at Walter. She placed her coffee cup on the table and wrapped both hands around it and said, in the clear, level voice of a woman who has spent decades saying difficult things plainly, "I'd like to know which unit you were with." Curtis looked at her. "My brother was James Calloway," she said. "Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. He was killed at LZ X-Ray on November 14th, 1965. He was 23 years old." She looked at Curtis without hostility, without drama, with simply the direct gaze of a woman who has asked a reasonable question and intends to wait for the answer. He knew every man in his platoon. If you were there, he would have known you. The table was silent in a new way. Not the silence of people who have witnessed something, the silence of people who are inside something and cannot move until it resolves. Curtis Boland stood up. He did it slowly, the way people stand when their legs have gone uncertain under them. He picked up his VFW cap from where it had been sitting on the table beside his plate, and he held it in both hands and looked at it. He looked at Ruth Calloway. He opened his mouth and nothing came, and he closed it. And then something happened in his face that was not at all what he had planned, which was that it simply told the truth without his permission, the way faces do when they are too tired to manage the alternative. He sat back down. "I wasn't there," he said. He said it quietly. He said it to the tablecloth. Angela Tran's pen was completely still. Henry Potowski looked at his hands. "My father was there," Curtis said. His voice had a new quality, rough along the edges, as though it had not been used in a while for anything real. "He was with Charlie Company. He came home and he didn't talk about it, not once, not a word in 30 years. He stopped. He set the cap on the table. He died in 97. I found his discharge papers in a box in the garage. He stopped again. I don't know why he stopped a third time and did not start again. The silence stretched. Walter Briggs looked at Curtis Boland for a long moment. Then he looked at the cap on the table, the pins on the brim. 6 of them, carefully selected and carefully placed, the collection of a man who needed to wear something that felt like belonging to something. Walter said, "What was his name?" Curtis looked up. "What? Your father's name?" "Robert," Curtis said. "Robert Boland." Walter was quiet for a moment. He looked at the folded piece of paper in his pocket. He looked at Ruth Calloway, who had gone very still. "Robert Boland," he said. He said it slowly, the way you test a familiar word in an unfamiliar context. "Charlie Company." "Yes." Walter reached into his pocket and unfolded the list. He looked at it for a long time. "Your father is not on this list," he said. "This is only the men who were killed." He looked up at Curtis. "Your father came home." "Yes. Then there are men on this list who came home because of men like your father. That is how it worked. That is how it always worked." He folded the paper again. "The men who came home are part of the story. They are not a lesser part." Curtis Boland looked at him with an expression that Walter had not expected to see, which was the expression of a man who has been carrying something badly for a long time and has just been shown a different way to carry it. It was not relief exactly. It was something less comfortable and more real than relief. Ruth Calloway said quietly, "James talked about the men in his unit in his letters. He wrote every week, right up until he didn't." She looked at Curtis. "What was your father's first posting in the battalion?" And something in the conversation turned. Walter Briggs sat back in his chair. He let it happen without him. He held his cup of iced tea and he watched Ruth Calloway lean forward across the table toward Curtis Boland, asking the questions only a sister could ask, and he watched Curtis answer them with the halting honesty of a man who is not sure what he knows but is trying to find out. And he thought about Robert Boland, who had come home from a valley in the Central Highlands and had gone into a garage in Rockford, Illinois, and closed the door on that part of himself so completely that his son had spent decades trying to find the door. Walter knew something about that. He did not find it difficult to understand. Joanna found him at the table 40 minutes later. By then the group had expanded. Angela Tran had brought over a man from the post named Gerald, who turned out to have processed discharge records for a brief period in the late 1960s, and Henry Potofsky had said more in the last 30 minutes than he had said at any Memorial Day event in recent memory. And Curtis Boland had produced his phone and was looking at photographs of his father's discharge papers, which he had photographed years ago and never quite known what to do with. Joanna stood behind her father's chair for a moment, reading the table, reading the room, reading her father's face. She put her hand briefly on his shoulder. He put his hand over hers, just for a moment. "You want cake?" she asked. "Is it good cake?" "It's sheet cake. From the Kroger on Ashland." "Then yes," Walter said. She went to get it. Walter looked across the table at Ruth Calloway, who was now showing Curtis something on her own phone. A photograph, Walter thought, though he couldn't see it clearly. A family photograph, maybe. The kind that gets kept. He had not expected Ruth Calloway. He had not come to this table expecting her, had not planned the list, had not calculated where this would lead. He had come because the names deserved someone to say them in the presence of someone who had been using them wrongly, and that was the whole of it. He had lived long enough to know that the whole of a thing is usually sufficient. He thought about the list in his pocket, 14 names. He had written them down in a hospital in Chi Non in January of 1966, lying in a bed with his right hand bandaged and a nurse named Delors who kept telling him he needed to sleep. He had written them because he had been afraid of losing them, which is not the same as being afraid of anything else. He had been afraid of the way sleep and time and painkillers could take the edges off things that needed their edges kept. He had not lost a single one. The afternoon settled into itself the way afternoons do. People drifted. The buffet was replenished and then slowly depleted. The PA system worked its way through its playlist a second time, and somewhere during God Bless America, the microphone cut out and was fixed by a post member who had fixed it before and knew exactly where to apply pressure. Curtis Boland stayed until 4 o'clock. Before he left, he came to where Walter was sitting with Phil and Joanna, and he stood in front of Walter for a moment and didn't say anything, and then he said, I'd like to find out more about what my father's unit actually did. If there are records, or I don't know how to go about it." Walter told him about the National Archives. He told him about the unit history that had been compiled by a veteran of the 7th Cavalry who had spent 12 years doing it. He told him about the Drang Veterans Association, whose pin Ruth Calloway wore. He did not tell Curtis that everything would be fine. He did not know if everything would be fine. He knew that knowing was better than not knowing, because he had lived both and one of them was heavier. That was as much as he could offer, and it was enough. Curtis shook Walter's hand at the end. He shook it differently than he had at the beginning, which Walter noticed and did not comment on. What Walter did not know, driving back up to Kenosha that evening with Phil at the wheel, and Joanna in the passenger seat, and the May countryside going long and green outside the window, was that Angela Tran had been taking notes on her pad for the last hour of the luncheon, that she had gone home that evening and written, in a post on a Veterans History Forum she'd moderated for 3 years, a detailed account of what she had witnessed, including the 14 names from Walter's list, which he had read aloud a second time at Ruth Calloway's request, slowly and fully, each name given its complete weight. The post attracted 240 replies by midnight. By the following morning, it had been shared across 11 different groups. A historian at the University of Illinois, who specialized in the Drang campaign, sent Angela a direct message asking if she could connect him with the man described in the post. Ruth Calloway saw the post at 10 o'clock that night, sitting in her car outside her house in Joliet, because she'd been thinking too hard to go inside. She called her daughter from the car. "I was at a Memorial Day thing today," she said, "and something happened that I need to tell you about." She talked for 20 minutes, and in Rockford, Curtis Boland sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and a cup of coffee that had gone cold and read the post 3 times. He had the discharge papers spread on the table next to him. His father's face, in the one photograph Curtis had, looked up from a corner of the table, a young man, serious, squinting into light that might have been morning light anywhere, California or Kentucky or the Central Highlands of Vietnam. Robert Boland had come home. He had closed the garage door. He had raised a son and sold real estate and attended barbecues and Memorial Day events, and he had carried what he had carried in a room inside himself with no windows and no door that his son had ever been able to find. Curtis picked up the photograph. He held it for a while. He put it down and opened the unit history link that Walter Briggs had given him, and he started reading on page 1, and he did not stop until after midnight. Walter Briggs pulled into his driveway in Kenosha at 6:45. He let Biscuit out into the backyard and stood on the back steps in the May evening while the dog investigated the far corner of the fence with the methodical optimism of a retriever who has checked this corner 1,000 times and is not yet prepared to conclude there's nothing there. The sky over Kenosha was doing something good, that particular shade of late spring evening that had no other color in it. Walter watched it for a while. He went inside. He fed Biscuit. He made himself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table and took out the list, and he read through all 14 names, the way he did sometimes in the evenings, not as a ritual, not as a grief, but simply as an accounting, a way of saying, "I know you, I still know you, that part has not changed." He folded it back along its lines and put it in his shirt pocket. He called Joanna to let her know he'd gotten home because she worried. He talked to her for 11 minutes. She told him about a conversation she'd had on the drive back with Phil about expanding their kitchen, and Walter listened and offered 2 opinions and asked 3 questions, because he was interested, because her life was interesting to him, because this was the life he had come home from the Central Highlands in order to live, and he had not forgotten that. He went to bed at 10. He read until 11. Biscuit settled at the foot of the bed with the authority of a dog who has claimed this position through 12 years of consistent effort and will not be revisiting the decision. Walter turned out the light. He lay in the dark in a house that held him, in a city he knew, at the end of a day he had not planned but had lived fully, the way he had tried to live most of them, the way the men on the list had deserved to live theirs. That was what it came back to, always. Not the valley, not the grass, not the specific quality of the heat. The fact that they had been real. The fact that their reality required someone to insist on it occasionally in rooms where it was in danger of being papered over with something easier and louder and less true. Walter Briggs had been insisting on it for 59 years. He intended to continue. He was very good at continuing. If this story moved you, if you believe the men who carried these names deserve to have their own name remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor. We tell these stories every week because they deserve to be told, and because the silence that surrounds them is not peace. It's just silence. Ring the bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. For Calvin, for Andre, for Leonard, and for every man whose name is still waiting for someone to say it out loud.